March 12, 2024, 6:47 in the morning. The mist hangs low over Franklin, Tennessee, clinging to manicured lawns and creeping between the dogwood trees that line Magnolia Drive. It's the kind of peaceful suburban Tuesday where the biggest concern should be traffic on the commute or whether the coffee's ready. But on this particular morning, peace shatters. A convoy of unmarked vehicles rolls silently to a stop outside a modest brick house with white shutters and a welcome mat that reads "Blessed." Tactical officers emerge, their movements practiced and precise, their faces set with the gravity of a mission 23 years in the making. Neighbors peer through curtains, phones already raised to capture what will become the defining moment in their quiet community's history. Within minutes, the door opens, and a man in a bathrobe, gray-haired, bespectacled, unremarkable in every visible way, is led out in handcuffs. His name will ricochet across Nashville by noon, igniting a firestorm of disbelief, anger, and vindication. Because this arrest doesn't just close a case. It reopens a wound that never truly healed. 23 years earlier, on a September evening still shadowed by national tragedy, a young dreamer vanished from Nashville streets. The search consumed the city. The silence that followed consumed a family. And now, as cameras flash and neighbors whisper, justice, delayed, doubted, but never abandoned, finally arrives at a doorstep in Franklin. The man being placed into the back of that patrol car isn't a stranger to this story. He was there from the beginning, hiding in plain sight, wearing the mask of a helpful witness while a mother's heart broke and a case went cold. But the mask has cracked. The lies have unraveled. And Music City is about to learn that some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, will claw their way back into the light. Her name was Jessica Raine Carter, and she arrived in Nashville in January of 2001 with a battered guitar case, $300 in savings, and a heart full of songs no one had heard yet. 22 years old, with auburn hair she wore in a loose braid and eyes that friends described as perpetually searching for the next melody, Jessica embodied every archetype of the Nashville dreamer. But she was more than a cliché. She was the daughter of Linda and Robert Carter, raised in a suburb of Memphis where she'd sung in the church choir since she was 7 and written her first song at 13. Her parents had encouraged her music, even as they worried about the precarious path she'd chosen. Nashville wasn't just a city to Jessica. It was a promise. She moved into a cramped apartment in the Belmont neighborhood, sharing the space with another aspiring songwriter named Megan Torres. Megan would later recall how Jessica kept a strict routine. Mornings at a coffee shop on 12th Avenue South, serving lattes and collecting tips. Afternoons spent in their living room, guitar on her lap, scribbling lyrics into a spiral notebook she never let out of her sight. Evenings at open mic. Nights scattered across downtown, from the Bluebird Cafe to dive bars where the stages were barely big enough for a stool and a microphone. She wasn't flashy. She didn't chase fame with the desperation that consumed so many others. She simply wanted her songs to matter. Those who heard her perform remembered a voice that was raw and honest, capable of rendering a room silent with a ballad about heartbreak or loss. September 14, 2001. Began like any other day in Jessica's carefully constructed routine. The world was still reeling from the attacks 3 days prior. The city felt subdued, the honky-tonks quieter than usual, the conversations heavier. Jessica worked her morning shift, making small talk with regulars who noticed she seemed distracted. Around 2 in the afternoon, Megan saw her return to the apartment, excited in a way she hadn't been in weeks. Someone had called about a songwriting opportunity. Producer, Jessica said. Someone with connections who wanted to hear her material. She changed clothes, choosing a simple sundress and her favorite boots. She grabbed her guitar and that spiral notebook. She told Megan she was meeting him near Percy Priest Lake, a location he'd suggested for its quiet and inspiration. Megan thought it was odd but didn't press. Jessica kissed her on the cheek, smiled that searching smile, and walked out the door. She left behind a half-written song on the music stand in the corner of their living room. The last line she'd penned read, "Some roads don't lead where you think they'll go." By midnight, when Jessica hadn't returned and wasn't answering her phone, Megan's concern turned to alarm. By dawn on the 15th, it became terror. Jessica Raine Carter, the dreamer with the honest voice and the spiral notebook full of unsung melodies, had disappeared. And Nashville, still grieving a national tragedy, was about to confront a nightmare much closer to home. September 16, 2001. 11:30 in the morning. Megan Torres's hands shook as she dialed Nashville Metro Police, her voice cracking as she explained that her roommate hadn't come home and wasn't answering calls. The dispatcher's tone shifted from routine to urgent when Megan mentioned Jessica's car. A teal Honda Civic was also missing. Within an hour, Officer Daniel Reeves arrived at the Belmont apartment to take a report. He noted Jessica's belongings were still there. Wallet on the kitchen counter, apartment keys on a hook by the door. Only her guitar, notebook, and purse were gone. Megan recounted the details of the previous day, emphasizing the mention of a producer and a meeting near Percy Priest Lake. Reeves radioed the information immediately. By mid-afternoon, a patrol unit spotted the teal Honda in a gravel parking area off Stewart's Ferry Pike, a secluded access point to the lake frequented by fishermen and hikers. The car sat alone, driver's door slightly ajar, keys dangling in the ignition. Jessica's purse was on the passenger seat, her wallet inside with cash and ID intact. There was no guitar, no notebook, no sign of Jessica. The scene was perplexing. If she'd met someone here, where had they gone? Why would she leave her keys and purse? Detective Laura Simmons, a 12-year veteran of Metro's Missing Persons Unit, arrived as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the water. She studied the car with a meticulous eye, noting the absence of struggle. No broken glass, no blood, no torn fabric. The driver's seat was adjusted for someone of Jessica's height. A half-empty bottle of water sat in the cup holder. Everything suggested she'd parked, exited willingly, and then vanished. A fisherman named Gerald Poole came forward that evening after seeing news coverage of the search. He'd been at the lake the previous evening around dusk. He remembered seeing a young woman matching Jessica's description standing near a vehicle, not her Honda, but a dark SUV parked close by. She appeared to be talking to someone inside. Poole couldn't see the other person clearly, but he recalled the woman seemed calm, even gesturing with her hands as if in conversation. He'd thought nothing of it at the time. Now his memory felt like a lead, thin but vital. Simmons ordered an immediate search of the surrounding woods and shoreline. Bloodhounds were brought in, tracking Jessica's scent from the car to a trail leading toward the water, then losing it abruptly about 50 yards in. Did she get into another vehicle? Did someone force her away? The questions multiplied faster than the answers. By nightfall, volunteers from Jessica's church and the Nashville music community joined law enforcement, combing through underbrush with flashlights, calling her name into the darkness. Linda and Robert Carter arrived from Memphis late that night, their faces etched with a dread no parent should know. Linda clutched a photo of Jessica, showing it to every officer, every volunteer, begging them to find her baby. The first 48 hours are critical in any missing person case. As the clock ticked past midnight on September 17th, hope still flickered. Jessica could be injured, lost, confused. She could still come home. Detective Simmons worked through the night, pulling phone records, interviewing Jessica's co-workers and fellow musicians. One name kept surfacing in conversations. A man named Vincent Hall, a part-time talent scout and venue manager known around the local music scene. Several people mentioned he'd shown interest in Jessica's performances, offering vague promises about connections and opportunities. Simmons added his name to the interview list. But as dawn broke on the 18th, and the search entered its third day with no trace of Jessica beyond that abandoned car, the terrible possibility began to settle over everyone involved. This wasn't a case of a young woman losing track of time. This was something far darker, and in the chaos of a post-9/11 world, where the nation's attention was fixed on distant enemies, Jessica Raine Carter was becoming another name on a growing list of the missing. The search continued, desperate and determined, but the window of hope was closing. And somewhere in Nashville, someone knew exactly what had happened to the girl with the spiral notebook full of songs no one would ever hear. The transformation from active investigation to cold case doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow erosion, a gradual shift from urgent action to resigned documentation. For the Carter family, this transition was nothing short of torment. In the weeks following Jessica's disappearance, Detective Laura Simmons pursued every lead with relentless focus. Vincent Hall, the venue manager whose name had surfaced repeatedly, was brought in for questioning on September 22nd. He presented as cooperative, almost eager to help. Yes, he knew Jessica. Yes, he'd spoken to her about her music. No, he hadn't seen her on the 14th. He'd been at a venue in East Nashville that evening, managing a show. His alibi was corroborated by 3 employees and timestamped security footage. Simmons pressed him about the producer Jessica had mentioned to Megan. Hall shrugged, suggesting it could have been any number of people in Nashville's sprawling, often predatory music industry. He even offered names of other scouts and managers who operated around the lake areas, claiming they used the scenic locations to create atmosphere for auditions. The leads scattered like buckshot. Each name Hall provided led to another interview, another alibi, another dead end. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of Jessica's Honda yielded frustratingly little. Fingerprints belonged to Jessica and Megan. Fibers and trace evidence were consistent with everyday use. There was no sign of a struggle, no foreign DNA, no smoking gun. The cell phone found in her purse, a basic Nokia model common in 2001, was processed for fingerprints, but its digital capabilities were limited. The technology to extract deleted data or location history didn't exist at the local level. The phone was logged into evidence and filed away. Gerald Poole's description of the dark SUV near Jessica's car sparked a canvas of vehicle registrations, but without a plate number or make, the pool of possibilities was overwhelming. Simmons and her team tracked down dozens of dark SUVs owned by people in Jessica's orbit, each resulting in alibis or explanations that held up under scrutiny. By November, the media attention that had briefly elevated Jessica's case began to wane. National news was dominated by the war in Afghanistan. Locally, other crimes demanded resources. The billboards along I-40 featuring Jessica's face remained, faded reminders of a search that had stalled. Linda Carter refused to return to Memphis. She rented a small apartment in Nashville, turning it into a command center wallpapered with maps, timelines, and copies of police reports she obtained through sheer persistence. Every morning, she drove to Percy Priest Lake and walked the trails, searching for anything investigators might have missed. Every afternoon, she visited the coffee shop where Jessica had worked, talking to customers, asking if they'd seen anything unusual that September. Her marriage to Robert began to fracture under the weight of their grief. He needed to work to maintain normalcy, to believe that Jessica might still walk through their door one day. Linda needed answers, needed to tear Nashville apart brick by brick if that's what it took. The divide became a chasm. By 2003, the case was officially classified as a suspected accidental death or possible abduction by a transient offender. The theory was grim but statistically plausible. Jessica met someone at the lake, was overpowered or lured away, and her remains were somewhere in the vast wilderness surrounding the water. Simmons, who had moved on to other cases but never stopped thinking about Jessica, kept the file on her desk. She reviewed it quarterly, looking for something she'd missed, some thread she could pull. Vincent Hall's name appeared in the file, but always with the notation, alibi verified. The music scene continued its rhythm. New dreamers arrived in Nashville with guitars and notebooks, chasing the same promise Jessica had. Some made it, most didn't. And in the cold case unit of Metro Police, Jessica Raine Carter became file number 01-4762, a name that detectives would occasionally mention to each other with a sigh and a shake of the head. The case wasn't forgotten, but it was frozen. Linda Carter's vigils at Centennial Park every September 14th became a fixture. A small gathering of the faithful who refused to let Jessica's name fade into obscurity. But as the years accumulated, 5, then 10, then 15, the likelihood of resolution seemed to diminish with each passing season. Cold cases go cold for a reason. Evidence degrades. Witnesses move away or die. Memories blur. Technology advances, But the window of opportunity closes. Jessica's case appeared destined to remain in that limbo. A tragedy without resolution. A question without an answer. Except that somewhere in the evidence room, in a box labeled 01-4762, sat a Nokia cell phone that held secrets no one had yet unlocked. And somewhere in Nashville, a man named Vincent Hall continued his life, his alibi intact, his reputation untarnished, his secret buried so deep he believed it would never surface. He was wrong. Every investigation operates within the constraints of its time. In 2001, digital forensics was in its infancy. DNA analysis was powerful but limited by database size and processing capability. Social media didn't exist to map connections and movements. Surveillance cameras were sparse, their footage grainy and often unrecoverable. Detectives relied on interviews, physical evidence, and instinct. In Jessica Carter's case, those tools pointed in every direction except the right one. The fatal blind spot wasn't incompetence. Detective Simmons and her team worked the case with diligence and care. The blind spot was assumptions. Vincent Hall presented as helpful. He was known in the community, respected even. He managed venues, connected artists with opportunities, and his demeanor during questioning was earnest and forthcoming. When he provided his alibi for the evening of September 14th, working a show at the Riverside Tavern in East Nashville, it was backed by multiple witnesses and security footage showing him at the venue from 7 p.m. until after midnight. The timestamps were clear. The witnesses were credible. The alibi was ironclad. Except it wasn't. What investigators didn't know in 2001 was that Vincent Hall's connection to Jessica ran deeper than casual professional interest. What they couldn't see was the pattern of behavior that colleagues would later describe as obsessive but carefully concealed. Hall had a method, a practiced way of ingratiating himself with young female artists, offering mentorship that occasionally crossed into inappropriate territory. But he was skilled at reading boundaries, at pulling back before anyone could label his behavior as predatory. Jessica had confided in exactly one person about Hall's attention, a fellow musician named Rachel Winters, who performed at some of the same open mic nights. Rachel would later recall, in interviews conducted decades after the fact, that Jessica mentioned Hall had called her multiple times in the week before her disappearance. He'd talked about a producer friend who was in town briefly, someone who could really elevate her career. Jessica was skeptical but intrigued. She asked Rachel if she should take the meeting. Rachel, unaware of any danger, had shrugged and said it couldn't hurt. That conversation never made it into the original investigation. Rachel had moved to Los Angeles in late 2001, and no one thought to track her down. The investigative focus had been on identifying the mysterious producer, not on re-examining someone whose alibi was already verified. The second critical oversight involved the dark SUV Gerald Poole had seen. Investigators canvassed registrations but didn't think to cross-reference vehicle ownership with people who had access to multiple vehicles through their work. Hall managed several venues, and part of his job involved transporting equipment. He had regular access to a venue-owned black Ford Expedition, a detail that appeared in his employment records but never intersected with the investigation's vehicle canvas. The Expedition was owned by the venue's parent company, registered under a corporate name that didn't flag in the database search focused on individual owners. The third blind spot was technological. Jessica's Nokia phone, logged into evidence, had been examined for fingerprints and call logs. The incoming and outgoing call records from her service provider were obtained and analyzed. They showed several calls to and from numbers associated with her family, Megan, and the coffee shop where she worked. There were also 3 calls from an unknown number in the days before her disappearance. Investigators traced the number to a prepaid cell phone purchased with cash at a convenience store. A dead end in 2001. What they couldn't access was the content stored within the phone itself. Deleted text messages, unsent drafts, and contact entries that Jessica might have removed. The technology to perform advanced mobile device forensics existed in federal labs but wasn't routinely available to local police departments for cases without clear evidence of federal jurisdiction. The phone sat in its evidence bag, a Pandora's box that wouldn't be opened for 2 decades. The most damning blind spot, however, was the one created by Vincent Hall himself. His strategy was simple and devastatingly effective. Be the helpful witness. He volunteered information. He expressed sympathy for the Carter family. He even showed up at one of Linda Carter's vigils, offering his support and lamenting the tragedy of a talented young woman lost too soon. This behavior is counterintuitive to most people's understanding of guilt. Surely a guilty person would distance themselves, avoid attention, stay silent. But Hall understood human psychology. By inserting himself into the narrative as an ally, he controlled the perception. He was the concerned community member, not the predator. And it worked. His name appeared in the case file 37 times across various reports and interviews. Each time, he was noted as cooperative, helpful, and cleared. The file documented his alibi in such definitive terms that subsequent reviewers had no reason to question it. When cold case detectives briefly examined the file in 2008 and again in 2014, Vincent Hall's name appeared as a dead end, a witness thoroughly vetted and eliminated. The investigation's fatal flaw wasn't what they did. It was what they didn't think to question. They didn't question an alibi that accounted for Hall's whereabouts during the evening, but not the afternoon when Jessica had told Megan she was leaving for the lake. They didn't question why a venue manager would have such detailed knowledge of other scouts and producers in the area. They didn't question the coincidence of a prepaid phone calling Jessica in the days before she vanished. The answers were there, scattered like puzzle pieces across the case file, but the picture they formed wouldn't become clear for 23 years. Because in 2001, Vincent Hall was just another helpful witness. And Jessica Carter was just another missing dreamer in a city full of them. Linda Carter did not forget. While the city moved on, while the case file gathered dust, while Vincent Hall continued managing venues and living his carefully constructed life, Linda remained. She became a fixture in Nashville, a ghost haunting the places her daughter once walked. Every September 14th, she organized a vigil at Centennial Park. The first few years drew crowds, friends, fellow musicians, sympathetic strangers. By year 5, the numbers dwindled. By year 10, it was Linda and a handful of faithful attendees, holding candles against the dark and singing the songs Jessica never got to record. Linda's apartment, that command center she'd created in 2001, never changed. The maps remained taped to the walls, routes marked and remarked. The timeline stretched across an entire wall, a visual representation of her daughter's final days, annotated with questions that had no answers. She filled notebooks with theories, pursuing leads the police had long since abandoned. She called Detective Simmons monthly, then quarterly, then annually as the years stretched on and Simmons eventually retired. Strangers who met Linda described her as simultaneously broken and unbreakable. Her hair turned silver. Her face acquired the deep lines of someone who has carried unbearable weight for far too long. But her eyes retained a fierce determination. She wasn't waiting for closure. She was hunting for it. In 2019, 18 years after Jessica's disappearance, Linda made a decision that would alter the trajectory of everything. She hired a private investigator named Marcus Reed. Reed specialized in cold cases, working on a hybrid model. He took payment where families could afford it and worked pro bono when they couldn't. Linda fell into the latter category. She'd spent her savings on the Nashville apartment and the years of searching. She had nothing left except her conviction. Reed was moved by her story and agreed to take the case. His approach was methodical. Rather than chase new leads, he decided to digitize and reorganize everything that already existed. He obtained copies of the police file through Linda's victim advocacy rights, scanned every document, and began building a digital database with search and cross-reference capabilities. He created a timeline that was more detailed than anything previously constructed, mapping not just Jessica's movements but those of every person mentioned in the file. It was tedious work. Months passed as Reed sorted through thousands of pages of reports, witness statements, and evidence logs. And then, in August of 2019, he found it. Evidence log entry 4762-09. One Nokia mobile phone, property of victim, recovered from victim's vehicle, processed for prints, call logs obtained, stored in evidence room locker E-12. Reed stared at the entry. He pulled up the forensic reports. Fingerprint analysis. Conducted. External examination. Conducted. Call log acquisition. Conducted via service provider. But there was no entry for digital extraction. No examination of the phone's internal memory. He called Linda immediately. Could it be possible that after all these years, Jessica's phone still held information that had never been accessed? Linda's hands trembled as she held the phone to her ear. Reed explained that technology had advanced exponentially. What was impossible in 2001 was now routine. He had contacts in forensic labs who specialized in legacy device data recovery. If the phone still existed, if it hadn't been destroyed or lost in an evidence room purge, there might be something there. Linda contacted Detective Simmons, who had maintained a relationship with her even in retirement. Simmons used her connections to verify the phone's status. It was still in evidence storage, logged and sealed. She pulled strings to have it released for re-examination. In September 2019, exactly 18 years after Jessica vanished, Reed hand-delivered the Nokia phone to a forensic specialist in Atlanta named Dr. Chun, who had pioneered techniques for extracting data from obsolete devices. The process took weeks. The phone's battery was long dead. The circuitry was corroded. But Dr. Chun was patient and meticulous. And when she finally accessed the device's memory and began recovering deleted files, she called Reed with news that made his pulse race. The phone contained text messages. Deleted text messages. And among them was a draft, never sent, timestamped to September 14, 2001, at 3:47 p.m. The message read, "Something feels wrong." There was more. Much more. But in that moment, standing in her Nashville apartment surrounded by maps and timelines and 18 years of unanswered questions, Linda Carter allowed herself something she hadn't permitted in nearly 2 decades. She allowed herself hope. The Nokia phone that sat in Dr. Chen's laboratory in Atlanta represented a time capsule from an analog age on the cusp of digital transformation. In 2001, these devices were revolutionary, portable communication in your pocket. But their memory was limited, their capabilities primitive by modern standards. What investigators couldn't have known was that deleted data on these early phones wasn't truly erased. It was simply marked as overwritable space. If new data didn't fill that space, the old data remained, dormant but recoverable with the right tools and expertise. Dr. Chen's work was painstaking. Using specialized hardware that interfaced with the Nokia's ancient circuitry, she bypassed the degraded operating system and accessed the raw memory. Over the course of 3 weeks in late 2019, she reconstructed fragments of Jessica's digital life from September 2001. The recovered text messages painted a chilling picture. On September 10th, Jessica received a message from an unknown number. "This is Vincent from Riverside Tavern. Got your number from the open mic list. I have a contact you need to meet. Real deal producer. Interested?" Jessica's reply, "Maybe. Tell me more." The conversation continued over several messages. Vincent, because the number was eventually traced back to the prepaid phone identified in the original investigation, laid out a scenario. The producer's name was Marcus Delaney. He was in town for only a few days, scouting for a major label. He'd heard Jessica perform and was impressed. But he was busy, and the only time he could meet was late afternoon on the 14th, out near Percy Priest Lake where he was staying at a friend's cabin. Quiet place. Good for listening to her material. Jessica expressed skepticism in her responses. "Why the lake?" Vincent's reply, "He likes to hear artists in a natural setting. Says it reveals authenticity. I know it sounds weird, but he's the real thing. I can come with you if you want." Jessica's final message in the chain, sent on September 13th. "Okay, I'll meet him. What time?" The next recovered message was the unsent draft from the 14th at 3:47 p.m. "Something feels wrong. Dr. Chan also found a sent message from earlier that afternoon, one that had been deleted shortly after sending, addressed to Megan. "Meeting him at the lake spot. Wish me luck." The timestamp was 2:18 p.m. The messages were devastating in their implications. They placed Vincent Hall not as a peripheral figure but as the architect of Jessica's final movements. But there was a problem. The prepaid phone number couldn't be definitively proven to belong to Hall. The messages referred to Vincent, but without additional corroboration, a defense attorney could argue it was a different Vincent, a coincidence, or even fabricated data. Marcus Reed knew they needed more. He reached out to the Nashville Cold Case Unit, which had recently received new leadership and funding. Detective Sergeant Emma Gallagher, a 38-year-old investigator with a reputation for tenacity, took the meeting. Reed presented everything: the recovered messages, the timeline, the gaps in the original investigation. Gallagher listened, her expression unreadable. When Reed finished, she asked a single question: "Do you still have physical evidence from the vehicle?" The answer was yes. Jessica's car had been processed for fingerprints and trace evidence, but samples had been preserved according to protocol. Gallagher requested the evidence be pulled. What she was particularly interested in was touch DNA. In 2001, DNA analysis focused primarily on biological fluids: blood, saliva, semen. Touch DNA, the genetic material left behind by skin cells when someone makes contact with a surface, was a developing field but not routinely tested. By 2022, when Gallagher officially reopened the case, touch DNA analysis had become highly sophisticated. Samples from the steering wheel, door handle, and gear shift of Jessica's Honda were sent to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation lab. The process took months. The samples were degraded, contaminated by time and the handling of multiple people during the original investigation. But forensic scientist Dr. Angela Reeves worked with methodical precision, isolating and amplifying the genetic material. In April of 2022, she obtained a partial DNA profile from cells recovered from the steering wheel. The profile was incomplete. Only 12 of the standard 20 markers were viable. But 12 was enough to run through databases. The DNA didn't match anyone in CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database. It didn't match Jessica or Megan. It belonged to an unknown individual who had touched the steering wheel of Jessica's car. Gallagher now had two pieces of a puzzle: messages suggesting Vincent Hall orchestrated Jessica's movements, and DNA from an unknown person in her car. What she needed was to connect them. The solution lay in a field that had revolutionized cold case investigations over the previous 5 years: forensic genealogy. Gallagher reached out to a genetic genealogist named Patricia Holloway, who had worked on several high-profile cases. Holloway explained the process. Upload the unknown DNA profile to public genealogy databases where people voluntarily share their genetic information to find relatives. Build family trees from the matches. Use traditional genealogy to narrow down to potential suspects. It was a long shot. The partial profile might not yield enough matches. The suspect's family might not have anyone in the databases. But Gallagher authorized the work. Holloway uploaded the profile to GeneMatch and Family Tree DNA in May of 2022. Within weeks, she had matches: distant cousins, third and fourth degree relatives. She began the meticulous work of constructing family trees, tracing lineages back through generations, identifying common ancestors, and then moving forward to identify living descendants who fit the investigative profile. The digital ghosts of Jessica's final messages and the DNA miracles of modern science were converging, piece by piece, on a single name. And in Franklin, Tennessee, Vincent Hall continued his life, unaware that the walls he'd built around his secret were beginning to crumble. Patricia Holloway's workspace was a study in organized chaos. Whiteboards covered with family trees filled her home office, each branch color-coded, each generation meticulously documented. For 6 months, from May through November of 2022, she worked the Carter case with single-minded focus. The partial DNA profile had yielded 17 matches in the genealogy databases, ranging from second cousins to fourth cousins twice removed. None were close enough to immediately identify the suspect, but they provided a roadmap. Holloway's process was part detective work, part genealogical archaeology. She started with the closest match, a second cousin once removed, and built their family tree backward, identifying parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. She cross-referenced historical records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, census data, obituaries. She traced the lines forward, mapping out all descendants of common ancestors. The work was tedious and emotionally taxing. Each branch represented real people, real families, most of whom had no connection to the crime. But somewhere in those branches was a killer. By August, Holloway had constructed a master tree with over 400 individuals. She began eliminating branches based on age, gender, and geographic location. The suspect had to be male, had to have been an adult in 2001, and had to have been in the Nashville area at the time. Branches fell away. The tree narrowed. In September, Holloway identified a cluster of families with Middle Tennessee roots. She cross-referenced names with public records, looking for anyone with a connection to the music industry or Nashville venues. One name emerged, Hall. The Hall family had deep roots in Davidson County, with multiple generations born and raised in the area. Holloway traced the lineage to a branch that included a Vincent James Hall, born in 1964, which would have made him 37 in 2001. She ran a background check. Vincent Hall had no criminal record. His employment history showed work at various venues around Nashville. In 2001, he'd been managing the Riverside Tavern. Holloway felt the familiar thrill of a break in the case, but she needed confirmation. She contacted Detective Gallagher with the name. Gallagher's reaction was immediate and visceral. Vincent Hall was in the original case file. He'd been interviewed. He'd been cleared. But now, with the genetic genealogy pointing directly at him, Gallagher pulled the file and reviewed every mention of his name with fresh eyes. The alibi for the evening of September 14th was solid. But what about the afternoon? Jessica's deleted message indicated she was leaving to meet someone at 2:18 p.m. The timeline in the messages suggested the meeting was arranged for mid to late afternoon. Hall's alibi for the evening didn't account for those hours. Gallagher conducted a deep dive into Hall's life in 2001. She obtained employment records from the Riverside Tavern, now closed, through the parent company's archives. The records showed Hall's schedule. On September 14th, he'd been off until his shift started at 6 p.m. The afternoon was unaccounted for. She pulled vehicle registration records. In 2001, Hall owned a personal sedan. But the venue's records showed they also maintained a black Ford Expedition for equipment transport, and Hall had regular access to it as part of his job. It matched the description of the dark SUV Gerald Poole had seen near Jessica's car. The pieces were aligning, but Gallagher needed the DNA to be definitive. The partial profile from the steering wheel matched Hall's family lineage, but to bring charges, she needed a direct comparison. She couldn't simply demand a sample. Hall hadn't been arrested, and there was no legal basis to compel him. She needed to obtain his DNA surreptitiously. In November 2022, Gallagher initiated covert surveillance. The goal was to collect a discarded item containing Hall's DNA: a coffee cup, a water bottle, a cigarette butt. The surveillance team consisted of 4 detectives working in rotating shifts, tracking Hall's movements without detection. Hall, now 58 years old, had transitioned from venue management to part-time work at a community theater in Franklin. He volunteered at his church, sang in the choir, and maintained an outward appearance of respectability. The surveillance logs painted a picture of a quiet, routine life. November 23, 2022. Thanksgiving Day. Hall attended morning service at his church, then stopped at a Starbucks on his way home. Detective Warren Chun, part of the surveillance team, watched as Hall ordered a coffee, sat at an outside table, drank it while scrolling through his phone, then tossed the cup into a trash can before driving away. Chun waited 5 minutes, retrieved the cup using gloves, and placed it in an evidence bag. The cup was logged and sent to the TBI lab with a priority request. Dr. Angela Reeves, the same forensic scientist who had worked the touch DNA from Jessica's car, processed the sample. On December 7, 2022, she called Detective Gallagher with results. The DNA from the coffee cup matched the partial profile from the steering wheel. The statistical probability of it being anyone other than Vincent Hall was 1 in 3 trillion. Gallagher sat at her desk, staring at the report. 21 years after Jessica Carter vanished, she finally had her answer. The helpful witness, the concerned community member, The man with the ironclad alibi for the evening had been with Jessica that afternoon. He touched the steering wheel of her car, and somewhere between Percy Priest Lake and the lies he told investigators, Jessica had disappeared. Gallagher knew she had him, but she needed more. She needed to understand what happened, to build a case that would stand up in court. She authorized a deeper investigation into Hall's life, his patterns, his past. And as the team began pulling threads, they discovered something else. In 2015, 14 years after Jessica vanished, Linda Carter received a letter, postmarked from Nashville, no return address. The letter was brief and cruel. Jessica left town. She wanted a fresh start. Stop looking. You're only hurting yourself. Linda had turned the letter over to police at the time, but with no fingerprints or identifiable information, it had led nowhere. Now, Gallagher obtained the letter from evidence and sent it to a forensic document examiner. The handwriting analysis, combined with samples of Hall's writing obtained from public records, showed consistencies in letter formation, spacing, and pressure patterns. The letter hadn't been enough to identify him in 2015. But in the context of everything else, it was another piece of cruelty, another layer of his deception. Vincent Hall had spent 23 years believing he was untouchable. The family tree, built from the ghosts of his ancestors and the science of genetic genealogy, had finally revealed him. And Detective Gallagher was about to make sure he understood that some truths refused to stay buried. Surveillance is an art form built on patience, precision, and the ability to become invisible. For 3 months, from December 2022 through February 2024, Vincent Hall lived his life unaware that every movement was being documented, every pattern analyzed, every interaction recorded. Detective Gallagher assembled a team of 6 investigators, each with specialized skills. Their mission was twofold: gather additional evidence that could corroborate the DNA match, and build a behavioral profile that would help the prosecution understand the man they were about to charge. Hall's daily routine was clockwork predictable. He woke at 6:30 each morning in his modest brick home on Magnolia Drive. He drank coffee on his back porch, weather permitting, while reading news on a tablet. 3 mornings a week, he attended a 7 a.m. exercise class at the Franklin Community Center. Tuesdays and Thursdays, he worked at the Barn Theater, a community playhouse where he managed technical aspects of productions. Sundays, he attended Grace Fellowship Church, arriving early to help set up for services and staying late to assist with cleanup. To his neighbors, he was Vince, friendly but private, helpful without being intrusive. He mowed his lawn with meticulous care. He waved to dog walkers. He brought cookies to the annual block party. The surveillance team watched him interact with the world with a chilling normalcy. Detective Maria Santos, who led the physical surveillance, noted in her reports that Hall exhibited no signs of paranoia or guilt. He didn't check for tails. He didn't vary his routes unexpectedly. He moved through his life with the confidence of someone who believed the past was safely behind him. But beneath the surface, Gallagher's team was uncovering cracks. Digital forensics specialist David Park obtained warrants for Hall's electronic communications. Hall maintained an AOL email account he'd created in 1999 and never closed. Most people had abandoned such accounts long ago, but Hall kept his, using it occasionally for newsletters and online purchases. Park's examination of the account's archived messages revealed correspondence from 2001 that Hall had apparently forgotten existed. Among them were emails to Jessica Carter. The messages were professional on the surface, discussions about open mic schedules, comments on her performances. But read in sequence, they revealed a pattern of increasing familiarity that bordered on inappropriate. Hall's messages became more personal over time, asking about her life, her dreams, her relationships. Jessica's responses were polite but increasingly brief, a signal of discomfort that Hall either missed or chose to ignore. The final email, sent on September 13, 2001, was from Hall to Jessica. "Marcus is really excited to meet you tomorrow. This could be your big break. I'll text you the details." There was no Marcus Delaney. Gallagher's team had searched every database, every industry directory, every archive of music producers working in 2001. The name didn't exist. It was a fiction Hall had created to lure Jessica to the lake. On January 15, 2023, the surveillance team followed Hall to a storage unit facility in Cool Springs. Hall rented a 10-by-10 unit, which he visited approximately once a month. Warrants to search the unit were difficult to obtain without tipping off Hall, so Gallagher waited, documenting the visits and building a case for eventual access. Meanwhile, Detective Chun conducted interviews with people who'd known Hall in 2001. Most remembered him as competent but unremarkable. A few, when pressed, recalled behaviors that had seemed odd at the time. A former co-worker at the Riverside Tavern, named Sheila Morton, described Hall's reaction to Jessica's disappearance. She'd mentioned it at work a few days after the news broke, expressing sadness about the missing girl who used to perform at their open mics. Hall's response, Sheila recalled, had been oddly detached. Probably just ran off with some guy. These young girls, they're flighty. Sheila had thought the comment was callous, but Hall was known for being blunt, so she'd dismissed it. Now, 22 years later, recounting the memory to Detective Chun, Sheila's voice trembled. Another former colleague, Brian Tate, remembered something more specific. In late September 2001, Brian had borrowed the venue's Ford Expedition to move some equipment. When he returned it, he noticed the interior had been recently cleaned, detailed, shampooed, spotless. He joked with Hall about setting a new standard. Hall had shrugged and said he'd spilled coffee and wanted to clean it up properly. Brian hadn't thought much of it then. Now the memory carried a sinister weight. The surveillance also captured Hall's digital behavior. Park monitored Hall's internet activity through legally obtained warrants. Hall's browsing history showed a curious pattern. He regularly searched for news about cold cases being solved through DNA and genetic genealogy. In November 2022, shortly after the Thanksgiving coffee cup collection, Hall's search frequency increased dramatically. He visited forums discussing forensic genealogy, read articles about privacy concerns with DNA databases, and searched for legal information about statute of limitations on various crimes. Was he feeling the pressure? Did he sense, on some instinctive level, that the net was closing? Gallagher observed these patterns with satisfaction. Hall's behavior suggested consciousness of guilt, a legal concept that could be powerful in court. By February 2024, Gallagher had assembled a comprehensive case. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. The digital communications established premeditation. The behavioral profile suggested a calculated predator who'd successfully evaded justice for over 2 decades. But Gallagher wanted one more piece: confirmation of what happened to Jessica's remains. The lake had been searched in 2001, but technology had advanced. Ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs with improved training, and sonar mapping techniques offered new possibilities. In late February, Gallagher authorized a renewed search of the area around Percy Priest Lake, focusing on locations within a reasonable distance of where Jessica's car had been found. The search took 2 weeks. Teams combed through dense woods, scanned ravines, and mapped the lake bottom. On March 8, 2024, a cadaver dog alerted near a collapsed embankment approximately 3 miles from the original parking area. Excavation revealed skeletal remains buried under layers of sediment and debris from years of erosion. Dental records confirmed what everyone already knew. They'd found Jessica Raine Carter. The discovery was both a relief and a heartbreak. Linda Carter, who'd spent 23 years searching, finally had the answer she dreaded and needed. Jessica was gone. But now she could be brought home. For Vincent Hall, the discovery meant the surveillance phase was over. Gallagher had everything she needed: the DNA, the communications, the behavioral evidence, and now Jessica's remains, recovered from a location that only someone intimately familiar with the area would have known. On March 10th, Gallagher presented the case to the district attorney. Warrants were issued for Vincent James Hall's arrest on charges of second-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and obstruction of justice. The arrest was scheduled for March 12th at dawn. And as Vincent Hall slept in his modest brick house, unaware that his last night of freedom was slipping away, Detective Gallagher reviewed the case file one final time, thinking about the young woman with the spiral notebook and the songs no one ever heard. Justice had taken 23 years, but it was finally here. February 28, 2024. 4:37 in the afternoon. Dr. Angela Reeves sat in the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation lab, staring at the computer screen displaying two DNA profiles side by side. On the left, the partial profile from the coffee cup collected in November 2022, 13 usable markers extracted from the saliva Vincent Hall left behind on the rim. On the right, the degraded profile from the steering wheel of Jessica Carter's Honda, 12 markers painstakingly recovered from touch DNA deposited over 2 decades ago. Of those markers, 11 matched perfectly. The 12th marker on the steering wheel profile was inconclusive due to degradation, but statistical analysis of the 11 confirmed matches yielded a number that made Reeves pause. 1 in 3 trillion. To put that in perspective, the current population of Earth is approximately 8 billion. The probability that the DNA on Jessica's steering wheel came from anyone other than Vincent Hall was so infinitesimally small it effectively didn't exist. Reeves had worked hundreds of cases over her 15-year career. She'd seen matches before, delivered results that closed cases and brought killers to justice. But this one felt different. 23 years of silence, broken by skin cells invisible to the naked eye. She picked up the phone and called Detective Gallagher. The conversation was brief, professional, but Gallagher's relief was palpable through the line. The DNA was the keystone. Everything else, the recovered messages, the emails, the behavioral profile, supported the narrative, but the DNA was irrefutable. It placed Hall in Jessica's car. And his lies to investigators in 2001 meant there was no innocent explanation for his presence. Gallagher immediately escalated the case. She scheduled a meeting with District Attorney Rachel Monroe for March 1st. Monroe, a prosecutor known for her meticulous preparation and fierce courtroom presence, listened as Gallagher walked through every piece of evidence. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Monroe asked probing questions, playing devil's advocate, anticipating defense strategies. How would Hall explain the DNA? He couldn't claim he'd never been in the car. The evidence was there. Could he claim innocent contact? Perhaps he'd helped Jessica with something. Touched the steering wheel during a benign interaction? Gallagher countered with the messages. Hall had orchestrated Jessica's movements under false pretenses, using a fabricated producer to lure her to an isolated location. He'd never mentioned being in her car during the original investigation. His omission was damning. Monroe nodded, satisfied. She authorized the arrest warrants and began assembling the prosecution team. But Gallagher wasn't finished. On March 2nd, she received another call, this one from forensic document examiner Linda Tran. Tran had been analyzing the 2015 letter sent to Linda Carter, the one claiming Jessica had left town voluntarily. Tran's work involved comparing the handwriting to samples obtained from Hall old employment documents, a handwritten birthday card he'd signed for a coworker in 2018, notes from his church volunteer work. Handwriting analysis isn't as definitive as DNA, but in skilled hands, it can reveal patterns. Tran identified 7 points of consistent similarity between Hall's known writing and the letter: the distinctive way he formed the letter G with an exaggerated tail, the leftward slant of his script, the spacing between words, the pressure variation indicating he bore down harder at the beginning of sentences, the specific formation of capital J, the way he crossed his T with a slightly upward flourish, and the overall rhythm of the writing. Tran's conclusion: while she couldn't state with absolute certainty that Hall wrote the letter, the similarities were significant and consistent with him being the author. The probability was high. Gallagher added this to the case file. The letter demonstrated consciousness of guilt and a calculated cruelty. Hall hadn't just killed Jessica. He'd tormented her mother for years, feeding false hope to keep Linda searching in the wrong direction. On March 5th, 3 days before Jessica's remains were discovered, Gallagher received yet another piece of evidence. Digital forensics had continued analyzing Hall's internet activity. David Park found something chilling. In January 2002, just 4 months after Jessica's disappearance, Hall had searched for information about body decomposition rates in water versus soil, how long DNA could be recovered from remains, and whether touch DNA could survive extended environmental exposure. The searches were conducted from his home computer, logged in the browser history that Hall had apparently never thought to delete. These searches were, in legal terms, evidence of a guilty mind. Why would an innocent man, cleared by police, be researching forensic evidence degradation related to the exact type of crime Jessica's disappearance represented? Park also discovered deleted files on Hall's computer from 2001. Using recovery software, he retrieved fragments of documents. One file, created on September 21, 2001, exactly 1 week after Jessica vanished, contained a partially recovered text document. The readable fragments were chilling. Can't undo. Saw the fear. Didn't mean for. Lake was. Disposal? No one will. The fragments painted a picture of remorse mixed with self-preservation. A man grappling with what he'd done while simultaneously planning to evade consequences. On March 8, when Jessica's remains were found, the case transformed from circumstantial to concrete. The location of the remains, the DNA evidence, the digital trail, and the behavioral profile coalesced into an unassailable narrative. Gallagher met with Monroe again on March 9. They reviewed every piece of evidence, constructing the timeline that would be presented to a jury. The picture was clear. Vincent Hall had become obsessed with Jessica Carter. When she rebuffed his advances, he created an elaborate ruse to isolate her. He met her at Percy Priest Lake and something went catastrophically wrong. Whether he intended to harm her or whether a confrontation escalated didn't matter legally. Jessica died, and Hall made the conscious decision to hide her body and lie to investigators. For 23 years, he lived freely while Linda Carter suffered. On March 10, Monroe filed charges: second-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, and obstruction of justice. The warrants were signed by Judge Harold Brennan, and the arrest was scheduled for March 12 at dawn. That evening, Gallagher drove to Linda Carter's Nashville apartment. Linda answered the door, her eyes immediately searching Gallagher's face for news. Gallagher told her everything. The DNA match, the recovered messages, the impending arrest. Linda listened without interrupting, tears streaming down her face. When Gallagher finished, Linda asked a single question: "Did she suffer?" Gallagher answered honestly, "We don't know the details yet, but the medical examiner is working on it. What I can tell you is that Jessica fought. She left evidence. And that evidence is what brought us here." Linda nodded, wiping her eyes. 23 years of searching, and finally the answer. It wasn't the answer she'd wanted, but it was the truth. And truth, even painful truth, was better than the endless uncertainty. The match that changed everything was more than just DNA. It was validation of a mother's refusal to give up, proof that time doesn't erase justice, and confirmation that some secrets can't stay buried. March 12, 2024, 6:47 in the morning. The street lamps on Magnolia Drive were still glowing in the pre-dawn darkness, casting orange pools of light across sidewalks slick with overnight dew. The air carried the cool bite of early spring, temperature hovering just above 40 degrees, and a low mist clung to the ground, swirling around the wheels of the unmarked vehicles that rolled silently into position. For cars, strategically parked to block potential exit routes. 12 officers, a mix of Franklin Police Tactical Unit and Metro Nashville detectives, all wearing body cameras, all briefed on the subject and the potential risks. Vincent Hall had no history of violence in the legal sense. No arrests, no restraining orders, no documented confrontations. But he'd hidden a murder for 23 years, and cornered people could be unpredictable. The operational plan was straightforward. Secure the perimeter, approach the front door, announce law enforcement presence, and execute the arrest with minimal disruption to the neighborhood. Detective Gallagher led the team, flanked by Detective Santos and Sergeant Marcus Cole from Franklin PD. They'd chosen this early hour deliberately. Hall would be home, likely still in bed or just waking, disoriented and less able to mount resistance or destroy evidence. At 6:51, Gallagher gave the signal. The team moved with practiced efficiency, crossing the lawn in a tactical formation. 2 officers covered the back door. 2 more positioned themselves at the side windows. Gallagher, Santos, and Cole approached the front door, a heavy oak slab with a decorative wreath that read, "Welcome, friends." The irony wasn't lost on Gallagher. Cole knocked. 3 sharp, authoritative raps that shattered the morning quiet. Vincent Hall. Franklin police. Open the door. Silence. Then, from inside, the sound of movement. Footsteps. A light clicked on, visible through the frosted glass beside the door. The deadbolt turned. The door opened, and Vincent Hall stood there in a navy bathrobe and slippers. His gray hair disheveled, glasses perched on his nose. He looked at the assembled officers with an expression that Gallagher would later describe in her report as resigned, almost relieved. He didn't ask why they were there. He didn't demand a warrant. He simply said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I wondered when you'd come." Gallagher identified herself and stated the purpose clearly. "Vincent James Hall, you're under arrest for the murder of Jessica Raine Carter, abuse of a corpse, and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. Do you understand these rights?" Hall nodded. "I understand." Cole handcuffed him. Hands behind the back, metal clicking into place with a finality that echoed in the quiet morning. By this time, neighbors had begun to emerge. The Johnsons from across the street stood on their porch, mouths agape. The Millers next door peered through their front window. A jogger stopped mid-stride, phone out, recording. By noon, the footage would be on every local news station. Gallagher escorted Hall to the waiting patrol car. As they walked across the lawn, Hall spoke again. "I knew you'd come eventually. 23 years is a long time to carry something like this." Gallagher didn't respond. Anything Hall said was being recorded, and she wasn't going to prompt a statement that could later be challenged as coerced. Hall was placed in the back seat of the patrol car. Santos remained with him while Gallagher and Cole re-entered the house to begin the search authorized by the warrant. The interior of Hall's home was meticulously organized. The living room featured a modest couch, a television, shelves lined with books, mostly classics and music history. The kitchen was clean, dishes drying in a rack by the sink. The bedroom held a neatly made bed, a nightstand with reading glasses and a Bible, a closet full of organized clothing. In the home office, investigators found Hall's computer, which was seized for forensic analysis. They also found a filing cabinet containing personal documents. In the bottom drawer, tucked inside a folder labeled Miscellaneous Receipts, they found something unexpected, a small spiral notebook with a worn cover. Gallagher opened it carefully. Inside, in neat handwriting, were song lyrics. She flipped through the pages, recognizing some of the titles from Jessica's performances that had been documented in the original case file. The final page contained an unfinished song with the last line, "Some roads don't lead where you think they'll go." It was Jessica's notebook, the one she'd been carrying the day she disappeared. Hall had kept it for 23 years. The discovery was both heartbreaking and damning. This wasn't just evidence. It was a trophy, a keepsake from a crime he'd thought he'd gotten away with. By 8:30 a.m., the search was complete. Hall was transported to the Metro Nashville Detention Center for booking. The arrest made immediate headlines. Local news stations broke into morning programming with the announcement, "Arrest made in 23-year-old Jessica Carter cold case." The story spread quickly. Social media erupted with reactions ranging from relief to outrage. People who'd known Hall expressed shock and disbelief. How could Vince, the helpful guy from church, the volunteer at the theater, be a killer? Others who'd known Jessica shared memories and tributes, celebrating the news that justice had finally found her. Linda Carter received a call from Detective Gallagher shortly after the arrest. Linda had been awake since 5 a.m., unable to sleep, waiting for the news. When Gallagher confirmed Hall was in custody, Linda broke down, sobbing with a mixture of relief, grief, and exhaustion. She'd waited 23 years for this moment, and now that it was here, the weight of those years crashed down on her all at once. Hall was arraigned later that day. He appeared before Judge Brennan via video link, still wearing the bathrobe from the arrest. The charges were read. Bail was set at $2 million, which Hall could not post. He was remanded to custody pending trial. As he was led away from the video screen, Hall turned back and spoke one final sentence. "Tell her mother I'm sorry. It was an admission, a confession wrapped in an apology. And it was recorded, logged, and added to the mountain of evidence that would bury him in the courtroom." November 4, 2024. Davidson County Criminal Court. Courtroom 3A. The trial of Vincent James Hall began under intense public scrutiny. Every seat in the gallery was filled, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in an adjacent room. Local and national media had covered the case extensively since the March arrest, but now the evidence would be laid bare, the narrative fully revealed. District Attorney Rachel Monroe led the prosecution, flanked by Assistant DAs Kevin Tran and Sarah Holloway. Hall's defense was handled by veteran criminal attorney Marcus Eldridge, appointed by the court after Hall claimed indigence. Eldridge was skilled and tenacious, known for finding weaknesses in seemingly airtight cases. The jury, 7 women, 5 men, ages ranging from 28 to 67, had been seated after 2 days of voir dire. Monroe's opening statement was concise and powerful. She outlined the timeline: Jessica's arrival in Nashville, her dreams, her disappearance, the 23-year search, and the breakthrough that led to Hall. She described the DNA evidence, the recovered messages, and the notebook found in Hall's possession. Her tone was respectful but unyielding. This is a case about a young woman whose only crime was trusting the wrong person. A young woman who had her entire life ahead of her, stolen in a moment of violence and hidden for over 2 decades. The evidence will show that Vincent Hall orchestrated Jessica Carter's final hours with premeditation and deceit. And when she disappeared, he lied to her family, to investigators, to this community, for 23 years. Justice has been delayed, but it will not be denied. Eldridge's opening was a study in reasonable doubt. He acknowledged that Hall had made mistakes, that his failure to disclose certain interactions with Jessica was regrettable, but he argued that the prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence and technological analysis that was open to interpretation. DNA on a steering wheel proves contact, not murder. Deleted messages prove communication, not intent. My client admits he knew Jessica Carter. He admits he spoke with her about music opportunities. But knowing someone and killing them are not the same thing. The prosecution wants you to fill in the gaps with assumptions. We ask that you look only at what can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution's case unfolded over 8 days. Dr. Angela Reeves testified about the DNA evidence, explaining the recovery process, the statistical analysis, and the irrefutability of the match. Under cross-examination, Eldridge pressed her on the degraded nature of the steering wheel sample, suggesting contamination could explain the presence of Hall's DNA. Reeves remained calm, reiterating that the protocols used prevented contamination and that the match probability was overwhelming. Patricia Holloway, the genetic genealogist, walked the jury through the family tree that had identified Hall. She used visual aids, large printed trees with color-coded branches, to illustrate how distant relatives had led investigators to Hall's doorstep. Her testimony was compelling, humanizing the science and demonstrating its reliability. David Park testified about the digital evidence. He presented the recovered text messages, the emails, and the deleted computer files. The jury listened intently as Park explained how Hall had researched forensic evidence degradation shortly after Jessica's disappearance. The searches displayed on a courtroom screen: how long does DNA last in water, body decomposition timeline, touch DNA survival rate, painted a damning picture. Eldridge objected repeatedly, arguing the searches were speculative and could have innocent explanations. Judge Brennan overruled most objections, allowing the evidence. The most emotional testimony came from Linda Carter. She took the stand on day 5, dressed in a simple black suit, her silver hair pulled back, her hands trembling slightly as she was sworn in. Monroe guided her through Jessica's life, her personality, her dreams, her final day. Linda described the 23 years of searching, the vigils, the private investigator, the moment she learned her daughter's remains had been found. She spoke about the letter she'd received in 2015, the one that had given her false hope and prolonged her agony. When Monroe asked how the letter had made her feel, Linda's voice broke. It made me believe she was alive somewhere, that maybe she'd come back. But it was a lie. He wanted me to stop looking. He wanted me to give up on my daughter. But I never did. Eldridge's cross-examination of Linda was brief and respectful. He asked if she'd ever met Vincent Hall. She said no. He asked if she had any direct knowledge of what happened to Jessica. She said no. He was careful not to antagonize her, knowing the jury's sympathy was entirely with the grieving mother. The defense presented its case over 2 days. Eldridge called character witnesses who testified to Hall's community involvement, his volunteer work, his reputation as a reliable and kind person. The strategy was to create cognitive dissonance. Could this man, beloved by his church and theater group, really be a killer? The prosecution countered effectively. Monroe called Rachel Winters, the musician who had been friends with Jessica. Rachel testified via video link from Los Angeles, describing Jessica's discomfort with Hall's attention. She recalled the conversation about the producer meeting and her regret at not discouraging Jessica more forcefully. She was excited but nervous. She asked me if I thought it was safe. I told her it was probably fine. I've lived with that guilt for 23 years. The forensic pathologist who had examined Jessica's remains testified about the cause of death. The skeleton showed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck or falling and hitting a hard surface. The injuries would have been incapacitating but not necessarily immediately fatal. The pathologist's testimony suggested Jessica had died from a combination of head trauma and exposure, possibly left to die rather than killed outright. It was a grim detail that visibly affected the jury. Hall chose not to testify. Eldridge advised him that taking the stand would open him to cross-examination that could be devastating. The prosecution's evidence was strong, and Hall's own words, from the deleted files, the searches, the statement at arrest, could be used against him. On November 13th, closing arguments began. Monroe delivered a methodical recap of the evidence, connecting each piece into a coherent narrative. She displayed photos of Jessica, young and vibrant, alongside the spiral notebook found in Hall's home. He took her life and then he took her voice. But evidence doesn't lie. Science doesn't forget. And Jessica's story, though silenced for 23 years, is finally being told. Eldridge's closing emphasized reasonable doubt. He argued the prosecution hadn't proven how Jessica died, hadn't established motive beyond speculation, and relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence. If you have questions, if you have doubts, you must acquit. That's the law. The jury deliberated for 8 hours over 2 days. On November 15th, they returned a verdict. Guilty on all counts. Second-degree murder, abuse of a corpse, obstruction of justice. Hall showed no reaction as the verdict was read. Linda Carter, seated in the front row of the gallery, wept quietly. On January 10, 2025, Hall returned for sentencing. Judge Brennan delivered a statement before imposing the sentence. Mr. Hall, you stole a life, devastated a family, and evaded justice for over 2 decades. Your actions demonstrate a profound disregard for human life and the truth. This court cannot restore what you took, but it can ensure you face the consequences. Hall was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Given his age, 60 years old at sentencing, it was effectively a life sentence. He was led from the courtroom without a word, returning to the detention center before transfer to a state prison. Outside the courthouse, Linda Carter addressed the media. Her statement was brief but powerful. Jessica was a dreamer, a daughter, a friend. She deserved to live, to share her music, to grow old. Vincent Hall stole that from her. But he couldn't steal her memory, and he couldn't stop us from finding the truth. Justice took 23 years, but it finally came. The courtroom reckoning was over. But for Linda, and for everyone touched by Jessica's story, the work of healing had only just begun. Spring arrived in Nashville with the familiar explosion of color. Dogwoods blooming white and pink, azaleas painting yards in vibrant purples, the air warm and sweet with the scent of new growth. On April 19, 2025, under a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at, Jessica Raine Carter was finally laid to rest. The service was held at Woodlawn Memorial Park, a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of the city where rolling hills met ancient oak trees. A modest crowd gathered, family, friends, fellow musicians who'd never forgotten the girl with the honest voice, and detectives who'd worked tirelessly to bring her home. Linda Carter stood at the graveside, her face lined with grief but also something else. Peace. She held a single white rose in one hand and a worn spiral notebook in the other. The notebook had been returned to her after the trial, evidence no longer needed. She opened it to the final page and read aloud the last song Jessica had written, her voice trembling but strong. Some roads don't lead where you think they'll go, / some dreams get lost in the undertow, / but every voice that's been silenced will someday be heard, / in the wind, in the rain, in the song of a bird. The cemetery fell silent except for the rustling of leaves and the distant call of a mourning dove. Linda closed the notebook and placed it gently on the casket alongside the rose. "You're home now, baby," she whispered. "You're finally home." After the service, a gathering was held at a small venue downtown, the same place where Jessica had performed her last open mic night 23 years earlier. Local musicians had organized a tribute, recording a completed version of Jessica's unfinished song using the lyrics from her notebook and composing music to match the spirit of her work. The recording played through the venue's speakers, and for 4 minutes, Jessica's words filled the room, her voice, though never captured, present in every note. The case had broader implications that rippled through law enforcement and the legal system. The successful use of forensic genealogy in Tennessee prompted other cold case units to revisit unsolved crimes, submitting DNA evidence for genealogical analysis. Within a year, 3 additional cold cases in the state were solved using similar methods. The Jessica Carter case became a teaching example in forensic science programs, a demonstration of how persistence, advancing technology, and family advocacy could overcome even the most carefully constructed lies. For Linda, the resolution brought something she hadn't expected: the ability to remember Jessica without the constant, crushing weight of the unknown. She could think about her daughter's laughter, her music, her dreams without those memories being immediately followed by the agonizing question of what happened. She knew now, and while the truth was painful, it was also liberating. Linda returned to Memphis in the summer of 2025, moving back to the home she'd shared with Robert before everything fell apart. The marriage was beyond repair, but they remained in contact, united in their grief and their love for the daughter they'd lost. She began volunteering with a victim advocacy organization, helping families of missing persons navigate the impossible terrain of hope and despair. In Franklin, the community grappled with the revelation that a killer had lived among them for decades. The church where Hall had volunteered held a special service acknowledging the pain and betrayal. The theater where he'd worked installed a small plaque dedicating their season to all victims of violence and the families who seek truth. At Percy Priest Lake, where Jessica's final hours had unfolded, a local artist installed a memorial bench overlooking the water. The plaque read, "In memory of Jessica Raine Carter, 1979 to 2001, a dreamer, a daughter, a voice that will not be forgotten." And at the Bluebird Cafe, where Jessica had performed on countless Wednesday nights, her photo was added to the wall among the countless artists who'd graced that legendary stage. It hangs there still, a young woman with auburn hair and searching eyes, frozen in a moment before the world took her away. Vincent Hall serves his sentence at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution. He has given no interviews, made no public statements beyond his courtroom apology. He remains, by all accounts, a model prisoner, quiet, compliant, and alone. Some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, cannot stay hidden forever. Some voices, no matter how long silenced, will find a way to be heard. Jessica Raine Carter's story is a testament to the unbreakable bond between a mother and daughter, to the power of science married with determination, and to the idea that justice, though it may be delayed by years or decades, can still arrive. In Nashville, where dreamers come to chase impossible hopes, Jessica's story has become a cautionary tale but also an inspiration. Her songs, completed by other hands but born from her heart, play in venues across the city. And on quiet September evenings, when the air carries that particular weight of memory and loss, people gather at Centennial Park with candles, singing the song of a girl whose voice was stolen but whose story refused to die. Some roads don't lead where you think they'll go, but every voice eventually will be heard.